Mark chapter 14. Again, this week I did want to get a little bit further than what we're going to look at this morning, but next week we're going to be looking at the garden, and I really wanted to kind of give that a sermon all on its own. And so we're going to be looking at just a couple of verses this morning, but that's all right. Well, we're still making our way through here. Mark chapter 14, starting in verse 27. And Jesus saith unto them, All you shall be offended because of me this night. For it is written, I will smite the shepherd, and the sheep shall be scattered. But after that I am risen, I will go before you into Galilee. But Peter said unto him, Although all shall be offended, yet will not I. And Jesus saith unto him, Verily I say unto thee, that this day, even this night, before the cock crow twice, thou shalt deny me thrice. But he spake the more vehemently, If I should die with thee, I will not deny thee in any wise. And then it says, Likewise also said they all. And we'll stop there. Now, we understand where we are. The Passover meal has been taken. Communion has been instituted. Jesus and his disciples are now making their way over to the Garden of Gethsemane. And this short section that we just read this morning is the discussion that took place on the way to the garden. And if you understand a little bit of the geography there of Israel, of course, they had to go across the Kidron Valley and up their way to the Mount of Olives, which is where they would be making their way where the Garden of Gethsemane resides. And so perhaps it is as they're crossing the Kidron Valley here that this particular discussion takes place. And so on their way, it's where Jesus has this rather difficult discussion with the 11 remaining disciples here about their immediate future. And this is a discussion that accentuates both their pride, which that's pretty obvious, but it also accentuates the foreknowledge of Christ. And so in this, we will not only see the disciples for kind of who they are, but I think probably as well see us for who we are. And so that's kind of what I want to look at in the text this morning. And so again, verse 27, All you shall be offended because of me this night. And so Jesus tells the disciples this difficult truth. This would be unthinkable. Now, again, place yourselves into the shoes of the disciples. This would be unthinkable. Not only over the last few hours have they heard that one of them was going to betray him, which that alone shook them, right, to the point where every one of them ran around the table and asked, Is it me? Right? They had no idea it was Judas. This was unthinkable to them. But now he goes farther to say, not only is one of you going to betray me, all of you are going to be offended by me. And then he goes on, and we'll talk about in just a second, and quotes Zechariah, not only are you going to be offended, you're going to scatter. You're not even going to be by my side. And so again, this was something that would be incredibly difficult for these disciples to hear. Now, as we've seen throughout the book of Mark, this is a very close group. Now, think about all the things that they've done over the past few years. These men didn't just go out from time to time and do ministry together. These men were essentially a family now for 3 years, right? Spending time with one another, going, traveling together, and all the places that they walked, on foot. It's not like they're getting in different cars and carpooling, right? They're traveling together as a group, and they're telling stories, and they're growing together, and not only are they growing to their Savior, but Jesus was just as much a friend to them as he was anything else, and he was their rabbi, he was their Messiah, he was everything to these men. And we've discussed a little bit about the nature of the relationship between master or rabbi and disciple. It was a revered relationship in this culture, and so all of these factors lead to this just being an absolutely unthinkable truth that Jesus would tell these men that not only is one of us going to betray you, but that all of us are going to be offended and all of us are going to scatter. And so I think when we understand a little bit of that context, not that it excuses what Peter does or excuses what he says, but I think maybe it helps us understand a little bit more why Peter would be so vehemently against the fact that one of them could dare go against Jesus. Again, this isn't just somebody going against their Savior. This is somebody turning their back on a very close, precious friend, and let's just be honest, as real as any family member. And so it's with that we kind of get a little bit of the understanding of the pride of this particular group. Peter here is the focal point, but again, as we saw there at the end of verse 31, it says they're all saying the same thing here. But you understand Peter being the focus here. We get a little bit of the understanding of the pride and a view of their own idea of their own heroicism, right? Because that's kind of how Peter views himself here. He's the hero of the story. Now, before Jesus came to Bethany to resurrect Lazarus, which was an event that took place not long before the things that we're reading about, his disciples had reminded him about some of the recent threats to his life in Jerusalem. Right? So Jesus tells them, we got to go to Jerusalem. I got to go, see Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And they tell him, no, you can't go. Right? They wanted to stone you last time we were there. Right? You can't go. And then when Jesus made it very obvious that he was, in fact, going to go, it says that Thomas says this statement, let us also go that we may die with him. That's the statement that Thomas made, probably just a few weeks or a few short months even before the events of this night. Essentially, my point being, this was a group that viewed themselves and thought wholeheartedly that if something ever happened to Jesus, I'm going to be right there by his side. If Jesus were to die, then, take my life right alongside of his. I would never forsake him. I would never betray him. I would never leave him in his time of need. We will go and we will die together. But now, that is the exact opposite of what Jesus is telling them is going to happen. So more than that, again, not only are they going to be offended by that, but now they're going to scatter. Right? That's what he says there, verse 27. All you shall be offended because of me this night, for it is written, I will smite the shepherd and the sheep shall be scattered. And so this is a far cry from let's go and die with him. Right? This is something totally different. This is cowering away in the night as your friend and Savior is being dragged from trial to trial and ultimately crucified. Now, Jesus said this would happen because it was prophesied. He says this is going to take place because it is written. This is, again, this isn't something that is happening just because. This has been prophesied. This is something that the prophet Zechariah said would happen a long time ago. And this is another proof to us, and we've kind of been seeing this throughout. This is another proof to us that every detail of the crucifixion of Christ, every detail of this was planned beforehand by God. Not one aspect of the trials, of the crucifixion, of the garden, none of that was something that just took place because of the current circumstances. All of it was shaped and molded by the hand of God before the foundation of the world even began. Again, and why is that important for us to know? Because nobody took the life of Jesus. Jesus willingly laid it down. This is an essential, fundamental truth to our belief. Now, this was a peculiar prophecy I mentioned by the prophet Zechariah. Here's what it says in Zechariah chapter 13. It says, awake, O sword, against my shepherd, and against the man that is my fellow, saith the Lord of hosts. Smite the shepherd, and the sheep shall be scattered, and I will turn mine hand upon the little ones. This is the prophecy to which Jesus is referring. Now, this in of itself is really a stunning prophecy, that God would use the sword to smite whom he called my shepherd. Right? This is the wording of Zechariah. He says, use the sword against my shepherd. And furthermore, against the man that is my fellow. Now, we understand that the sword obviously represents death. It represents judgment. It represents execution. And then he goes on to refer to this, as I said, to the shepherd as my fellow. And that particular phrase there essentially means somebody who is on the same level. It equates somebody as an equal. And so here God is saying, take the sword and smite somebody else who is in fact my equal. This is a stunning prophecy that we find in the Old Testament. And so notice here, when he says this, that this is a fearful scattering. This is a fearful scattering. Again, back to what Zechariah said. He said, take the sword. He said, smite the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. Why are the sheep scattering? They're scattering because somebody came and attacked the shepherd. Right? That's why they're scattering. This is a fearful scattering. Why do I say that? Because I think it's important that we understand this. They didn't stop believing in Jesus, nor did they cease being one of his followers. They were scared and they didn't know what to do. Again, I don't say that to undermine the sincerity of what happened. I say that because what they did is significantly different than what Judas did. Okay, there is a difference here in the reaction. Not that one is good and the other is bad. They're both sinful, but we got to understand why they were done. They're different. Judas left never to return because Judas was not a real believer. Right? Judas is the epitome of what we would read in 1 John, which says, they went out from us, but they were not of us. For if they had been of us, they would no doubt have continued with us. But they went out, here's what it says, that they might be made manifest, that they were not all of us. And so you say, how could Judas do the kinds of things that he did? I say that Judas did what he did because he was never a real believer, and he did the things that he did to show that he was never a real believer. We should never read through the Gospels and think that could be a true believer doing those kinds of things. No, if you're doing those kinds of things, all you're doing is proving that you never were a believer in the first place. This is a difference. There's a difference in what Judas did and the other 11. They did what all of us do. They sinned. And let's not undermine it. They sinned. They turned their back on Christ. They ran at a moment of his greatest need. They sinned. Now, this doesn't mean, as I said, this does not mean that they were not true followers of Christ. Here's what it means. It means that they're human. It means that they have a sinful nature. It means that they deal with the same kind of problems that you and I deal with. Now, again, I don't say that to easily dismiss sin. I say that for I think it's easy for us to read stories like this in the Bible, 2,000 years removed from the situation, and point fingers and say, how dare they? How could they? You know, if only I were there, things would have been a little bit different. Friends, I'm telling you, if you read yourself into the story like that, you are doing exactly what Peter did the same night. They're just like you and I. We got to understand this. Again, in no way, shape, or form am I trying to dismiss or undermine what they did. What they did was wrong, and it needs to be called out as wrong. But we also don't need to sit there and read ourselves into the story like we're the hero that Peter thinks he was. Furthermore, look at what they did afterwards. If ever you think to yourself, I have done too much to be effective in the cause of Christ. Look at the sins of my life. How could God ever use somebody like me? Think about Peter after the cock crows, and he goes out and he weeps bitterly. What does Jesus do on the seashore just a few days later? He says, Peter, do you love me? Feed my sheep. Go look at the book of Acts. What did Peter and John and the other 11 do? Well, they were used radically for the cause of Christ and for the beginning of the kingdom. And so don't ever think to yourself, I've just done too much. I've sinned too great. The things I've done in my life are too much for God to use somebody like me. If you think that, you've missed the point of the gospel. Because he is able and willing to forgive all sins. Let's go on. Jesus tells them, all of you are going to be offended. Right? All of you. You're all going to be offended. We're going to smite the shepherd, and the sheep are going to be scattered. And this is so wonderful. I want you to catch this. All the times that kind of Jesus begins to talk about this night and the severity of the implications of all the things that are going to be taking place, of his death, every time he talks about this, here's what he does. He gives hope. Right? He never leaves it with just, I'm going to die and things are going to be terrible. He never leaves it with just that. Look at verse 28. But after that I am risen. Right? There is coming the darkness of the cross and Calvary and everything involved with that. But there's also coming a resurrection. Right? So don't miss the resurrection for all the doom and gloom. That's coming. Yes, it's going to happen. But there's light at the end of this tunnel. Right? After that I am risen, I will go before you into Galilee. And so just as he did during the Passover, with reference to the new kingdom, right? He takes them, eat this bread. This is my body. It's broken for you. Take and eat this, or take this cup. This is my blood, which is shed for you. This is the beginning of the New Testament. What does he say? I will drink this with you new in the kingdom. Right? My body's going to be broken. My blood's going to be shed. But there's also going to be a time where you and I are going to fellowship together again. Right? That's exactly what Jesus is doing here. After that I am risen, I will go before you into Galilee. Now that phrase there, I will go before you. That phrase really means to lead or to proceed. Jesus knows, as he just said, that after his death, that these men were going to be scattered. Right? How did the Zechariah passage talk about this? It's like a shepherd and the sheep. And so what does Jesus know? After the shepherd is struck, the sheep are going to scatter. And you know what sheep who are scattered need a shepherd. That's what they need. Jesus knows this. And so he knows this, that these men are going to be are broken physically, mentally, emotionally, all these things. You see them in the book of John. John really depicts this well after the death of Jesus. What do? They're literally hiding behind locked doors because, what would be the natural thought? Well, if they're coming after him, naturally they're going to come after us. Perhaps tomorrow night it's going to be us up on the cross, right? That would be the natural thinking of these 11 men. And so they're locked behind closed doors, closed locked doors because they're afraid. They need a shepherd. So Jesus says, after that I'm risen, I will go before you into Galilee. Well, what does that essentially tell them? What is happening to me is not necessarily happening to you, at least not yet, right? He's going to later on tell Peter, your time's coming. But as of right now, I'm going to be there. I'm going to go before you into Galilee. It was there at Galilee where Jesus later gives them the Great Commission. So he gathers these men who are scattered. In fact, you go read through the gospel references, and what you see is a scattered group. You see them a few times together in the room, but at least once Thomas is not there. Later on, you see 7 of them go fishing, but they're not all together. Luke tells the story of 2 of the disciples walking down the road to Emmaus, but the other's not there. What do we see? We see a scattered group. But at Galilee, they're all together. Jesus is there, and he's giving them their new marching orders. Right? That's what happens at Galilee. And so, in other words, the shepherd may have been smitten, and the sheep may have been scattered, but Jesus never stopped being the shepherd, nor did he ever stop caring for the sheep. It's just like the one who leaves the 99 and he goes after the one, and he'll fight when he needs to fight to get the one and bring him back into the fold. He's the shepherd, and as the shepherd, he cares for the sheep. And what makes the rest of the story so terrible is with that as its backdrop. With Jesus essentially telling these men, I am your shepherd, and as your shepherd, even after I'm smitten, I'm going to gather you back together as a good shepherd would do. Even after that, that is the backdrop of Peter's statement. Again, verse 29. And this is typically Peter. Right? I mean, that's really the only way. This is just typically Peter, verse 29. But Peter said to him, although all shall be offended, yet will not I. Boy, he's really puffing himself up here. This is similar to other statements that Peter has made in the Gospels. In John chapter 13, in the upper room, just a few hours before this happens, Jesus comes in and he takes the water pot and he begins to wash the feet of the disciples, which was kind of seen as, a degrading thing. This is certainly not something that a master would do to his disciples. This is not something that is done. And Peter gets offended by this. You don't do this. I should be the one washing your feet. It's just like John the Baptist. I should be baptized by you. I don't need to be baptizing you. Well, here Jesus is washing their feet, and he comes up to Peter, and it says in John 13, Peter saith unto him, thou shalt never wash my feet. Right? He's not angry. He's offended. That's the difference. He's offended that Jesus would do this. And Jesus answered him and says, if I wash thee not, thou hast no part with me. And it says, Simon Peter said to them, Lord, then not my feet only, but wash my hands and my head. Just dip me in the water. Just get all of me then, God. Matthew chapter 16. It says, from that time forth began Jesus to show unto his disciples how that he must go into Jerusalem and suffer many things of the elders and chief and priests and scribes, and be killed, and be raised again the third day. And it says, but then Peter took him and began to rebuke him, saying, be it far from thee, Lord, this shall not be unto thee. And so Jesus tells them exactly what's going to happen. And you can envision Peter, who, again, I just in my own vision of this, Peter was probably a large, muscular man. He was a strong, physical man, being a fisherman all those years. And you can imagine this strong guy just grabbing Jesus and saying, no, you will not do this. I will not let it happen. Because make no mistake, that's what Peter's thinking is. I will not let you die. Again, what is Peter? Peter's always the hero in his own story. Now, I say that not to condemn Peter as some unique example. I say that because all of us always try to make ourselves the hero of the story. We read through David and Goliath, and what do we think? Oh, yeah, I'm David. No, you're not. We're all Goliath. We got to understand who we are in the story here. Okay? And so Peter is showing us who we think we are. That's what we see in this. Now, we know that Peter was strong. We know that. But Peter views himself as stronger mentally than the rest of the world here. Right? That's the statement that he makes. He says, although all shall be offended, yet not will I. I'll be the one singular person going against the grain, Jesus. Everybody could be going this way, but if you want me to go that way, I'll go where you want me to go. Now, in this moment, I really think Peter believed this. I don't think Peter was saying something he knew to be false. I think he genuinely believed that in a moment of need, in a moment of stress, in a moment of difficulty, tribulation, whatever word you want to use, I genuinely believe that in this moment Peter thought, I will be there with Jesus. I'll be there by his side. So he really thought that in that moment there was nothing that would keep him from doing what he viewed as the right thing. Now, all of this shows that none of the disciples knew anything about the gravity of the situation that was about to take place. This has been a constant theme. We've talked about this several times. We don't know how much they knew was going to happen. We don't know if they knew exactly when it was going to happen. Obviously, we know that Jesus has told them it was going to. He's made allusion to it before coming to Jerusalem. He's talked about it now that they're at Jerusalem. But here's what we know also, that after his death, not a single one of them was thinking about, hey, you know what Jesus said? He's going to rise again. They'd either not paid attention or forgotten all about it. And so we don't know the degree to which they knew or even thought about what was about to take place, but here's what we know. They didn't have a single clue as to how bad things were actually going to be. In their minds, this just simply couldn't happen. Maybe they do take Jesus, maybe they do arrest him, maybe they do throw him into prison, but in the mind of Peter, you know what? I'll be right there in prison beside him. However, as I just said, if they had simply put together all the information that Christ had given them, they wouldn't be able to see that this was going to be a terrible, terrible situation. Now, in answer to Jesus, or rather to Peter's pride here, and arrogance, Jesus says this, verse 30. Verily I say unto thee, that this day, even in this night, before the cock crow twice, and I think that's important, thou shalt deny me thrice. Now, what makes this even more amazing, if that's even the right word to use, is that Peter had already been told this by Christ, even before the story that we just read. Peter had already been told this by Christ in the upper room. We read in John chapter 13. Again, John gives us a lot more of the events that took place in that room. And in John chapter 13, Jesus says, Simon Peter said unto him, Lord, whither goest thou? And Jesus answered him, Whither I go, thou cannot follow me now. But he said, But thou shalt follow me afterwards. And Peter said unto him, Lord, why cannot I follow thee now? I will lay down my life for thy sake. Same kind of thing. And Jesus answered him and said this, Wilt thou lay down thy life for my sake? He said, Verily, verily, I say unto you, the cock shall not crow till thou hast denied me thrice. And so just a few hours before the event that we're reading right here, Jesus had already told him this is going to take place. The same kind of thing. Peter being bold and kind of arrogant and prideful. I will lay down my life for thee. And Jesus says, not only you're not going to lay down your life for me, you're going to deny me. And here we are 3 hours later. And why is that important now? We understand this already happened. Because Peter has already been given this information and is still here. In verse number 29, he's still so much against what Jesus had already told him to say. No, even though everybody else is going to leave you, not me, I'm going to be right by your side. And it is at that point that again, Jesus had to tell him, no, Peter, before the cock crow twice, you will deny me 3 times. No doubt, and this is my assumption here, no doubt that over these past couple of hours as they went through the meal and as they're traveling now to the Mount of Olives, that Peter had kind of ruminated and thought about those words that Jesus told him. There's no way I'm going to deny him. I know that's what he said, but there's just no way I'm going to do that. I know me, right? You can just I know me. I know that I would never forsake him. I know that I'm never going to leave his side. There's no way. There's no way that I'm going to leave him. And then Jesus says, all of you are going to be scattered. And again, you can just kind of envision Peter just blurting out, no, everybody else could leave you, but I won't. And again, Jesus has to tell him. And why is it important that we understand that this is now the second time? Because Peter has already thought about these words. He's already been told this. He's thought about this. He's considered these. And here's the answer that Peter came up with. Jesus, you're wrong. This was a prophecy by the Son of God. And Peter says, no, you're wrong. If ever you want to see how prideful even a child of God can be. Look at this right here. Peter being told a direct prophecy by Jesus, Peter says, no, you are wrong, I am right. And again, why do I say that? Because we're Peter. Because anytime we try to do things our own way, you know what we're doing? We're saying, you are wrong, I am right. We're just like Peter. Luke records that when Jesus told him in the upper room, he began it by saying this, Simon, Simon, and whenever Jesus refers to Peter as Simon, that's a clue to us that, Simon, you're acting like your old self now. You're not being Peter anymore. You're being like Simon. All right, and so Jesus here says, Simon, behold, Satan has desired to have you, that he may sift you as wheat. But I have prayed for thee, that thy faith fail not. And when thou art converted, so Jesus is about to tell him, you're going to deny me. But here he says, but when you are converted, when you come back, strengthen thy brethren. And so what is he saying? Use this situation, because it's going to happen. Use this situation as a way to help and encourage and strengthen Christians down the line in the future when they also deny me, when they also betray me. You know why? Because it's going to happen to them as well. And so not only does Peter think himself stronger than the rest of the 11, again, they all will be offended, but not I. He thinks he's stronger than Satan. Jesus says, Satan has desired you. And you know what Peter says? Not only am I better than them, I can best Satan. He may desire to have me, but I'm not going to let him. This is how strong Peter thinks he is. And what is the most amazing thing about all of this, even further still, is that even now he doesn't stop. Right? Even now he doesn't stop. Verse 30, Jesus tells him again for the second time. In verse 31 it says, but he spake even the more vehemently. He's even more belligerent about this. You can think he's even getting louder. He's even getting more boisterous. No, Jesus, no, it will not happen. Again, he says, if I should die with thee, I would never deny thee in any wise. It's not going to happen. Again, you're wrong. All the warnings of Christ did nothing to stop his prideful heart. Now, I think it's important that we remember this. And we talked about this a long time ago when we introduced Mark. But most people, and I would include myself in that group, most people believe that Mark heavily relied upon Peter for the writing of his gospel. Right? We know that Mark was not an eyewitness to most of these things, and we know later on that Mark and Peter had a pretty close relationship. And so most people think that it was probably, some people even go so far as to say that this is Mark's gospel according to Peter. I wouldn't go quite that far. But they believe that Peter really helped Mark with some of these stories. And so when we're reading this particular story, again, if that is the case, and I believe that it is, then here we have Peter kind of retelling the events of this. And so when we see here in verse 31, but he spoke the more vehemently, this is Peter saying, let me tell you how prideful I was. Let me tell you how belligerent I was. Let me tell you how boisterous I got. And so Mark is writing this, again, kind of from the perspective of Peter, and this word vehemently here is a compound word in the Greek. It's two words put together, and this is literally the only place in the New Testament where that word is used. Nowhere else. Now you have the word vehemently, but nowhere else do you have this particular compound word that makes up that word vehemently in the New Testament. Archibald Robertson, he writes about this word. He says, this strong compound adverb is found only in Mark, and here's what he says, and probably preserves Peter's own statement of the remark, and I agree with that. Furthermore, Mark is the only one who records Jesus as saying Peter's denials would come before the rooster crowed twice. Everywhere else, he just says before the rooster crows. Here's a little bit more specific. Before the rooster crows twice. And why do I think that's important? Because if he crowed the second time, that means he had to have crowed the first time, and Peter heard the crow the first time, and he kept going. He kept denying him. At some point, again, Peter heard that second crow, and he knew what he did. And we'll see this later on at the end of this chapter. And the Bible tells us that he goes out and he weeps bitterly. But if he did not stop until the second crow, he heard the first one. And what did he do after that? He kept denying Christ. In fact, you go read the account, and not only does he deny him, but the Bible tells us that he uses incredibly strong language in his denial of Christ. It wasn't a simple, no, I don't know him. He was angrily cursing at the people who would dare suggest, aren't you one of his followers? It wasn't just a simple denial. And so again, I'm picturing Peter's own recall here. Thinking about, Jesus told me it would be before the second crow. And perhaps Peter's thinking back, I can remember hearing the crow the first time. And never once did it cross my mind. This is exactly what Jesus said would happen. And it was not until the second crow I remembered. And I went out and I wept bitterly. Now, Peter's insistent denial of this prophecy and the way in which he does indeed deny Christ makes Peter roll in this, stand out a little bit above the others. But again, we know and we understand that Peter's not alone in this, right? That's what it says at the end of verse 31. Likewise also said they all. Peter was not the only one who said, no, this will never be me. He just maybe said it a little bit louder than the rest of them, which is in keeping with Peter. All the 11 thought the same thing, and in essence said the same thing. Peter just kind of took it to another level. Now, none of them thought that they would be scattered, and none of them thought that they would deny him. But we understand, I mentioned it earlier, but after his arrest, it is only Peter and John who are following him from a distance. And then later at the cross, John's the only one there. Of these 11 men who knew him, who loved him, who had spent intimate time with him for the past 3 years, they couldn't even be bothered to watch the execution of the one they loved. Peter may have boldly led the charge of disbelief, but all the others fell in line. So in conclusion this morning, we understand and we know in this story, we obviously see the very clear dangers of that little thing called pride. Now, pride is a difficult thing because the more prideful we are, the less we think we have a problem, right? That's how pride in itself works. And so it's a difficult thing to even realize that you have. And of course, we know and we understand that there's variations on that word pride. There's a good pride. We want to take pride in a job well done. We want to make sure that we're doing things the right way, and that's a good pride. That's a good. In fact, I think it was just last week. Isaiah had gotten up and with no prompting, nobody told him to do it. He just got up and he went and he cleaned their room, which it's just that never happens, right? And so Isaiah got up and he went and cleaned and he did a good job. And afterwards, I was talking to him and he said, "Dad, I don't know what. I feel happy. I don't know what it is. I just feel happy." I said, "Well, that's because you got pride in a good job. That's good. You need to do that more." But and so there's a good pride. We also understand that there's a dangerous pride. Again, and it's dangerous because the more you're involved in it, the less you realize the problem that lies in front of you. We understand that the Bible talks, particularly the book of Proverbs, talks very clearly against the dangers of pride. Proverbs chapter 11, when pride cometh, then cometh shame. Peter epitomizes this. When pride cometh, then cometh shame, but with the lowly is wisdom. Proverbs 16, very well known. Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Proverbs 29:23, a man's pride shall bring him low, but honor shall uphold the humble in spirit. Why is this such an important story for us to know? Because Peter epitomizes all of these verses. Peter shows us not only the epitome of pride, but the epitome of what it leads to. Right? We don't need to envision Peter as the hero. We need to envision Peter as the one with his face in the dirt weeping because of what he'd done. Now, as we said, Peter thought himself to be a strong man, but Peter didn't know how truly weak he was until tragedy hit. And that is, I believe, typical for a lot of Christians. In other words, it's easy to boast of faith when your faith is never challenged. It's easy to say, "Oh, yes, I'm a Christian. Oh, yes, I'm a follower of Christ. Oh, yes, I faithfully obey His word," whenever people just let you do whatever you want, and it is never once challenged. But when the challenges come, when the difficulties come, when the tribulation comes, that's when the testing comes of your faith. That's when we will see just how faithful we truly are. Peter was, all of them were tested. All of them failed. The difficult times determine the level of our commitment to God. Not only do the challenging times challenge our faith, but they help us learn to lean on Christ. As the old adage says, you will fall where you lean. And it's very true. Peter was leaning on his own self, and he fell into bitterness. We need to be careful not to think of ourselves too big and too strong to fall, because that is typically when the rug is dragged out beneath our feet. And if you're not leaning on Christ, you'll fall. And as the Bible says, great will be the fall.